my challenge today is to build on what's happening with the beef language white paper. There's a range of people in the room that are very much involved in that. I'm presenting on behalf of the Beef Language Consortium, but there's members of the steering committee. I know Peter Greenham's in the room, who's on the steering committee representing AMIC. There's a whole range of other people, Rob Polkinghorn's floating around representing the consortium. Without doubt, it's the most challenging, it's the most complex, it's the most complicated project that I've managed in 17 years. But without doubt, it's the most important project I've managed in 17 years. I think this project sets the beef industry up for where we want to be in 2050 and beyond. This project will actually pinpoint some of the technologies, some of the changes that we potentially can value add on already a very good language that describes a whole host of complexity across the industry, but more importantly gives the beef industry some vision about where we should be in the future. And together with the processing sector, together with the retailing sector, the whole idea of a value chain for the beef industry is vitally dependent on the success of this project. So we'll skip through some of the changes that we'll see through that. It is complex and it is complicated because we've got a language that goes all the way through from the genetics and the genomics area that people have spoken about. It has to describe some of the traits that Phil and others and Michael Irons were talking about. It then has to relate into what happens in the carcass. It then has to relate on how you actually sell parts of that meat, both domestically and internationally. It then has to relate to how consumers perceive that meat domestically and internationally. It then has to relate to over 200 different cuts across the beef body. It then has to relate to nearly 9 different cooking methods that you can use beef for. And it then has to relate to nearly 36 different countries that all have different interpretations on what beef quality actually means. And we need a language that covers all of that gamut. And we need that language to actually compete not only here in Australia but also internationally, and we need that language to allow our partners, the whole supply chain, to be able to deliver that information right the way through to domestic and international consumers without interfering with their ability to differentiate the product. And we heard last night that one of the key attributes of the Australian beef industry going forward is how we differentiate our product both domestically and internationally, how we allow supply chains to capture the most of that value. So that's why it is complicated, that's why it is complex. And we have a look at that particular thing, and I'll just give one example of that complexity, and that's intramuscular fat or marbling. We've got a system where we measure intramuscular fat, so we can measure marbling in live animals through ultrasound. We can then take a little bit of carcass data, but we try and predict something called chemical fat from the ultrasound, and then we try and correlate with marbling. Then we go to a carcass, and we can do either osmeat marbling or we can do USDA marbling, right? And then we start getting really complex by talking about the variation within marbling, the frequency of marbling, the soluble content of the fat in marbling. Then we go to basically to the carcass assessment, and we find that correlation between what we see in the USDA marbling, so what they measure in marbling and what osmeat marbling is not the same, and both of those correlations don't actually line up with the intramuscular fat that the bull breeders are measuring in terms of chemical fat. They all have moderate correlations, but they're all not one. So we've got this complex decision making. Then we actually see the brand owner. I know a lot of brand owners are there. They talk about marketing osmeat marbling 2 and up, and they talk about marbling osmeat marbling 3 and up. So they're putting the language into that particular area. Then they go to the consumer and say, by the way, now we want to describe juiciness and tenderness, and we tell you that juiciness and tenderness comes from osmeat marbling that's related to USDA marbling, that's related to something called chemical fat, but ultimately it's chemical fat which drives juiciness and tenderness. So you think, how is the industry going to get its head around all that complexity if that one single trait has all of that complexity? And then we look at there's at least 30 different traits that also have the same complexity: pH, colour, retail beef yield. Now, retail beef yield, John Thompson and I did a bit of a lit review. There is actually 39 different definitions for retail beef yield across the world. Right? So what I describe as retail beef yield to what you describe as retail beef yield is totally different. Then we talk about saleable beef yield, and then we talk about lean beef yield, which is measured from CT scanning, and then we try and correlate that all back, and we think, how does this language actually evolve to do that? What I'm actually suggesting to you, there is a real point of difference that I think we're on the cusp of now. The technologies that we're seeing in the objective carcass measurement area are going to allow us to really expand some of these areas out. So the beef language white paper, initiated by Cattle Council with Alpha and with AMIC support. The white paper is designed to give all of the industry a view of what the future beef language can and should actually try and achieve. There's a formal definition there, I won't read that out, but basically that formal definition comes from a couple of different things. Pinpoint where we are at the moment. Pinpoint what the key features of the Australian beef language are at the moment. Pinpoint where we can put value adds to the current beef language, and more importantly, suggest what are going to be some of the transformational changes that can occur in the beef language that are going to position us in 2020 and beyond. That's the real focus of this beef language white paper, and we'll see a range of complexities coming out of that. That's the vision we've got at the moment, so we're just now sitting at the stage where we've done a whole range of different market access points. We've looked at trade market research. We've designed a consultation paper, and the consultation paper is not the definitive white paper. It's a starting point for industry to have a discussion around all of these things. So we're now developing a series of scenarios. We're going to come back to industry within the next couple of months with those scenarios, work with the steering committee, and then go out to industry and have a really good look at, say, what if the beef language could achieve these things? What would the beef language look like? And that's going to be part of the challenge that we've got. So we're going to industry road test that. Then the real challenge is how do we actually implement all of those changes and equip all of the industry to cope with those changes, given the technologies that we dreamed about a couple of years ago are really starting to emerge today. So I'll talk about some of those as we go forward. Lots of strong positives about the Australian beef language at the moment. So I wanted to make sure that people understood the Australian beef language has a lot of positives. Strong, consistent structure, works right the way through the supply chain. AusMeat is internationally well regarded. It's got a mandatory base for a lot of the QA principles that we have across the whole beef industry. A lot of those QA principles exist. It's got a really good focus on the physical description of a lot of the carcass components. The subsequent performance, actually what happens in the consumer, there is a slight disconnect between what is actually happening in the beef language and what is described to the consumer, and that's an area that we can look at. And there's a real challenge for us, as we saw over the last couple of days. You only have to walk around this pavilion to see the value adding that's occurring in the beef industry. We're yet to find a language that helps us describe some of that value adding that is occurring. And that's going to be some of the most important things that are emerged as the beef industry goes forward. So the plan of the beef language review, that's what we've got at the moment. We've got a series of reviews happening. We've got a whole consultation paper that's being developed. We've got this steering committee in place. The beef language review paper is out there. If people want copies, they can contact the authors to have a look at that. More importantly, there is now 12 to 14 technical papers in a range of different areas that summarise nearly 1,000 internationally peer-reviewed papers, as well as a lot of unpublished papers, to give us the technical information that we can describe out of that. So I think that industry resource is vital for industry to have a strong area. So the challenge that we have at the moment is we've got consumers at the far end starting to design for us meals language. They're starting to design and tell us they want aspects that describe the meal. Not only do they want to talk to us about juiciness and tenderness and flavour, they also want to describe omega-3 fatty acids. They also want to describe zinc. They also want to describe iron. They also want to describe how ready available that meal is and what some of the cooking times and other things that are in place with those meals. That meal solution concept is driving the Western world and now starting to emerge in most of the major markets for beef across the world. So unless we get the language equipped to handle that, how do we move that back into the meat language? And how do we move that language back to some of the stuff that we see on farm? So the challenge that I see is we will start to see the beef industry have to grapple not only with intramuscular fat, but what about the solubility of fat? What about the fatty acid profile that occurs within that fat? What about some of the linoleic acids that occur within that fat? What about iron and zinc? And when we talk about colour, what do we actually mean? Do we mean fresh colour? Do we mean retail colour? Or do we mean at the end point when it's actually cooked? And all of that is what the consumer really wants to do. So we've got a lot of work to do in those areas, and I think technologies are starting to emerge to help us with that. Here's the content. That's the formation of the white paper that we've got at the moment. It's just emerging at the moment. One of the things that is coming out of that is how do you actually, in the white paper, look at some traits and think about there. So people know that fat measurements have been part of the meat language for the last 20 to 30 years, P8 and rib fat. So it's all very well to say P8 and rib fat don't actually describe some of the elements of the carcass that we want to describe, but it's not all and well to go and say, well, we've got to replace them with something without knowing what that something is that we've got to replace them with. So hopefully you've seen some of the technologies we're playing around with, and I get really excited with the Xbox stuff that's next door, the 3D camera system, when we can scan a carcass, and not only do we have to just go 1 point or 2 points, we actually get a linear definition of the fat depth across the whole carcass. So instead of talking to you about P8 or rib fat, I talk to you about fat partitioning profile. Now that becomes a completely different language to have. And what's really exciting is what happens if I could do it on a live animal, so the same information on the live animal can be collected on the carcass as well. And if anybody's not excited, go and scan your hand next door with that little bit of apparatus, or get Sarah to help you do it. 3D imaging is the future of where we will be with that. So that's some of the things. Then we can start to describe carcass yield. Then we can start to put DEXAs in place and those type of things. So we get excited by that. Then we have the AusMeat language really starting to look like the 2040 industry that we really want to equip it to do so. And then we equip it back to the live animal assessment and do some of those areas with that. So here's all of the papers that we've got. I won't go through them. All those papers will be available to industry. There's a whole heap of issues that come out of that. Let's have a look at the livestock language. There's multiple pathways, there's selling systems, there's descriptions, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. There's inadequate descriptions for animals' age. But what are we actually trying to predict when we predict age? There's two elements. There are international markets who require age from the point of view of some of the health requirements, but realistically from the consumer, we couldn't give a rat's about age. We're trying to predict the maturity of the animal that influences the eating quality of that potential. We do it through other ways at the moment. We do it through ossification. But that's where we get excited by technologies. What happens if we could scan a carcass and instead of relying on a measure of ossification, we could use the actual bone density and cartilage density of the whole carcass and give you a maturity index out of that. That becomes objective, and that changes the way we will do things in the future. So I think that's some of the things we're there. Very limited use of commercial data sets. One of my great frustrations, and I've had a couple of months to think about it, we have 3.9 million cattle graded through MSA last year, and I think 422 of those cattle had genetic data linked to them so they could come back into the breed plan database. So I wasted 3,870 something odd thousand pieces of data that could have actually helped the Australian beef industry drive its genetic potential. And I think that's some of the things that we do. You know, Phil spoke about work out where the leakages in the industry are. There's a real leakage in the beef industry if we put so much effort into grading all of those carcasses and we can't link some of that information back through the databases that we have. So hopefully the MLA board and those challenges will come up. We've got poor estimates for store cattle. So we see store cattle and those type of things, but we don't actually use technologies like beef specs. We now know that beef specs can describe much more accurately the potential of store animals. But we've got to get that type of technology being applied, and we've got to get that type of technology being applied through the sale yards. So that's where some of the technologies, that 3D camera. What happens if all sale yard systems just had, as the animals are unloaded, they walk through this 3D visioning system and they got a yield potential and an intramuscular fat potential driven off that particular piece of technology. We've got to be adventurous enough to think that's the technology that we'll have in 5 years' time. And we've got to be adventurous enough to get that technology in place. We've got to have the leadership to say that's technology, this is where we are. And we don't want to go, I mean, Richard asked me about NLIS database and PIC data and all those other things. We've got the world's best database in terms of NLIS, and we don't link the genomics and genetics database with the carcass database, with the NLIS database, with the MSA database to give all of that information right the way through the system. Think about the leakages in the system that we waste with some of that restructure. So here's this value assessment. We've got all the inputs, we've got all the outputs, we've got yield, we've got eating quality, we've got to get the parallel language systems, we've got to get basis in place for trading systems. So producer feedback and data to drive productivity improvement. Right? If I'm a pig producer or I'm a poultry producer, I get real-time data every day. If I'm a milk producer, and I just saw one of the big federal government grants that was announced today, is linking infrared measurements of milk potential on a daily basis with genomic information to quantify milk capability of the Australian dairy herd. Now, why aren't we doing that? Right? We measure carcasses every day. We measure carcasses every day with really good technologies. We've got genomic technologies that can do the same, and the dairy industry laughs at us. They really do. And we need to put some of these in place. So, product selection for optimal value adding. We now know that there are certain cuts of meat that you value add because intrinsically they have different properties to other cuts of meat. What happens if we could scan individual primals and work out, based on their protein content, their omega acid content and their aging potential, which of those should be aged for what levels of aging and which of those should not be aged because they go much better into a fresh area. We're just starting to see some of the CT technologies and that emerge that will drive that, but that would be exciting. And we could then deliver optimal product benefit. So the key issues in the meat language: market eligibility, getting yield, getting eating quality grading, getting this provenance right the way through the system. It's going to require the industry with leadership and development to really say, this is our key point. This is where we want to be in 2020 or 2025. We have to get there by doing these things. So that's our challenge at the moment. Then we've got these transformational technologies, accurate yield technologies. There is no doubt from the lamb data and from some of the early beef data that we can scan carcasses in abattoirs and come up with reliable predictions for retail beef yield and for saleable beef yield and for lean meat beef yield in beef. And we can do that on carcasses a day. In lamb, they are now doing it on 10,000 lambs a day. And we need to just do it on 1,000 beef carcasses a day. So we have those technologies, and that people can have a look. I will give a little plug, go to the Beef Central area and have a look at some of those technologies that came out of presentations last year. But I get really excited with the hyperspectral camera. It's just next door, sitting in a glass box. Means we don't touch it at the moment. But that hyperspectral camera, we're now starting to use that to do not only intramuscular fat content, but we also can do fatty acid profile. We also can do zinc and iron content because it measures frequencies in the meat that we've not ever measured before. That's a handheld camera that can be measured them on a day. So what happens if we put those through the supply chain? Then we can utilise the MSA outcomes, and then we've got commercial ID. Simple little things. What happens if we could actually put QR codes on every single cut across the body and have traceability of those cuts as they go through different supply chains to work out where they are? Other industries are doing exactly that. So that's what the beef language needs to do. So our consumers, our producers, we need the traits and the language to reflect the consumer, but we need the traits and the language to come back to the producer for them to make selection decisions. There's concerns about accuracy and interpretability of feedback, and my concern is until we actually really grapple with this objective carcass measurement area, until we really get our feet dirty in this area, we're going to get consistent criticism about feedback. We have to get objective carcass measurement driving those areas. There's problems with dentition, there's problems with other measurements. I don't worry about dentition, I don't worry about ossification. What I really want to know is what's the trait that we should be measuring in 5 years' time or 10 years' time that actually describes the maturity of the animal that influences eating quality potential of that animal? And how do we measure that back on farm? Right? And technologies have to drive us to that endpoint. We worry about what a trait that was measured, we worried about a trait that was measured 30 years ago and try and improve the accuracy of that rather than thinking about what is the trait that we're actually trying to describe. And I think we get hung up with that. And we get hung up with tensions on MSA and complying with those sort of things. Producer organisations, they've got a range of different things. What I have seen though is there is great level of engagement between producers and processors, and that's right the way across the supply chain, to get these things right. They want to work together to get these things right, and they want to invest in the technology. So processors are investing in these technologies at the same rate producers are. And I hope that's going to be there. So all of those things, you know, where they have a discussion, develop technology for on-farm prediction so that links into off-farm prediction as well. So we've got to get that whole supply chain. And the language needs to reflect two things. The language needs to reflect not only the performance of eating quality, but performance of yield. More importantly, it needs to reflect the performance of each of the primals that the processors are harvesting out of those animals. And again, we need to be much more adventurous in some of those areas. So processors, they've got a range of things. They know that transformational areas are going to help with consumers. They want to do a whole host of different things about value adding onto the existing ciphers to create a different way of ciphers can be used. They want to review butt shape and dentition, but they don't want to take them out. They want to say what's better than what we've currently got and give us something better than what we've currently got, and then we can use something better to help us make our decisions as well. They don't want to make decisions without having better information. And we don't want them making decisions without better information. Meat colour and its relevance, we've got to do a lot of work on that. We've got to do a lot of work on that on MSA grading. So we've got to put objective carcass measurement technologies in. So the whole industry, at the moment we grade about 4 million cattle. We need to be grading about 8 million cattle. There's no reason why every animal in Australia doesn't, with really good grading systems, is not equipped to be graded. And I think that's some of the challenge the industry needs to think about. So brands, better descriptions of their, people who ask about raising claims, that's something for Cattle Council to have a look at. I'm a little bit more interested in the value adding. We need to describe to the consumer some of the elements of value adding and what we can do there, both domestically and for international exports as well. So, early observations, we've now done nearly 30 odd consultations on a range of different areas. I don't think lack of trust is the right way. I think there's a lack of communication. There's a lot of trust being put with processors and producers to actually equip us to move forward in the beef language of the future. The underlying principle, and everybody has said this in every consultation that we've had, don't give us a language that's not underpinned by accurate, credible and reliable information. Right? If you give us the next phase of language and you give us more subjective information, you've wasted our time and you've wasted industry's time. So we have to do that. Farm auditing is going to be increasing, so we need to have a bit more look at that. A lot of support for eating quality becoming a value add to the AusMeat language, and it is equipped to do that. Verified animal age, we need to think about maturity, and we need to talk about the lack of currency across the livestock system, because there is no real connect between what's happening in the livestock industry to the consumer industry unless we get that information flowing through the whole system. So there's some of the things. Pathway forward, we're going to continue with the consultation phase. I hope all the people in this room have the opportunity to participate in that consultation area as it goes forward. Look for the first draft of the white paper out sometime in July. Series of options and recommendations. Industry consultation and feedback. It is vital that the industry gets on board with this whole area. One chance to really get this beef language review right, and it's based on your consultation and feedback. Once we get that, the real hard work begins with the implementation. And let's have a look at an industry. This is our view of the future. What happens if we have a live export, a feedlot, a farm, a processor, boning, a wholesaler, food service, a retailer, value adding, and a consumer, where there is a continuous feedback set of information that flows right the way through the industry? What happens if that's backed up by 4 or 5 new pieces of technology that accurately describe the traits that we want to do? And what happens if all of the leading brand owners across Australia use this information to do much more creative value adding and much more creative differentiation to position their beef both domestically and internationally? That's the future of the beef language. Thanks very much.